Back with the 20th chapter of The Silver Crown by Robert C. O'Brien. Otto has been gone for over a day, which means that Ellen has to leave the cave on her bad ankle and figure out where he is. We will begin at the page break from where we left off. Outside the front door of the cave, she saw the rocks where Otto had climbed in and out of the crevasse. They were not so formidable as she had feared. It was rather like climbing the steps of a pyramid. You could take them one at a time, depending more on her knees than her feet. She scrambled to the top easily enough and found herself in the silent, birdless forest. But the rest of the way was like a bad dream and got steadily worse. Within half a mile, she knew that her ankle was not nearly as strong as she had thought. Perhaps part of the trouble was the extra weight of the rucksack. Her limp deteriorated into a painful hobble, and she had to stop and rest, leaning against a tree after every few steps. Still, she kept going a few yards at a time, and she did find some berries and ate them. The rain came on, not as a storm, but as a slow, chill, foggy drizzle that ran down her neck, soaked her shoes, and made her slacks stick wetly to her legs. It turned the ground slippery underfoot, showing her progress still further. Worst of all, it hid the sun, which she needed to guide her in order to keep from getting completely lost. She had to stay near the edge of the crevasse, forcing her way through thickets rather than detouring around them. By noon, she felt close to despair. She wanted to give up and go back to the cave. There, at least, she would be dry. She could sit before the fire and get warm, but if she did that, if she gave up, she would starve. She went on. By mid-afternoon, she had walked no farther. She slumped down on a fallen log under a huge oak tree, hoping that its branches would keep off at least some of the rain. Her hair hung lank and wet around her temples. Her clothing dripped, and after she had sat still for a few minutes, she began to shiver. The only warm part of her was her lame ankle, which throbbed and ached and burned. She should, she knew, build a fire. But how build a fire when every leaf, every twig was soaked and soggy? Then another thought came to her. If she could not light a fire, she might at least make a shelter from the rain. She had 2 blankets. She would make a tent of one and roll up under it in the other. She remembered how she and David, when they lived in the country, had made blanket tents. The easiest way was to find a long, low tree limb parallel to the ground, hang the blanket over it, and put a stone on each corner. So after a minute or two, she got painfully to her feet and started around the big bole of the oak tree to see if, by luck, it had such a branch. And then she discovered, to her relief, that she did not need to make a tent after all. Halfway around the tree, she found that the trunk, as big as a dining room table, was hollow, or at least more than half hollow. An opening like a wide door led into it, and the floor inside was deep with brown oak leaves. She stepped in and felt the dry warmth of the tree enclose her like an embrace. She spread one blanket, folded double over the leaves. Then she pulled off her wet socks, shirt, shoes, and socks, and spread them beside it to dry. She rolled herself in the other blanket and lay down. In 90 seconds she was asleep. When she awoke, it was still light enough to see, though just barely, and she heard a small rustling in the leaves near the entrance to the hollow. She lay, still moving, only her eyes to look. It was a chipmunk, a gay little animal, hardly bigger than a mouse, striped brown and white and black. He, too, had come in out of the rain. He sat up on his back legs like a squirrel and nibbled something he held in his forepaws. It looked like a piece of bread. Bread? In the forest? How could that be? Then, as Ellen watched, the chipmunk finished the bit he was eating, darted out the door, and came back in a minute with a bigger piece. A mushroom! Ellen rolled over so she could see better. The leaves rustled under her. The chipmunk looked at her, made a tentative hop toward the door, and waited, watching her. He did not want to go back out into the rain unless he had to. Ellen moved again. Slowly the chipmunk stayed where he was. Gradually she inched herself to where she could see the door. The chipmunk quite calmly began to eat again. Obviously this big sluggish creature was not going to hurt him. Through the door Ellen could now see where he had found his meal. Back perhaps 30 feet stood a broken-off tree trunk, a tall, jagged stump, and out of it, sides and top, grew a small forest of the white crescent-shaped mushrooms. What had her father said long ago? The white ones that grow on stumps are... She could not remember. But they were, he had said, good to eat. How to be sure they were the same? She pulled her blanket around her, stepping softly, skirting the chipmunk, and walked barefoot into the rain. They looked the same. She broke off a crumb and tasted it. Oyster, that was the name. Oyster mushrooms. They had a faint oysterish taste, but they were really more like meat, or like meat and bread mixed. She broke off another piece. It was delicious. She knew that some mushrooms tasted all right, but were nonetheless poisonous. Still, the chipmunk was eating them. Could they poison people and not chipmunks? She doubted it. She picked a handful. She picked a double handful and took them back to the hollow as night fell. She ate them and went back to sleep, feeling warm, full, and reasonably content. The next day her walking improved, and so did the weather. Though it stayed cloudy and chilly, the rain stopped, and the ground dried out underfoot. She limped along quite nimbly all morning. Though without the sun to guide her, she still had to stay within sight of the crevasse. She had taken with her enough mushrooms to last the day. In fact, she had taken them all, except a few she left for the chipmunk. Early in the afternoon, something began happening to the crevasse. With each few hundred feet she progressed, it grew narrower, until, except for her ankle, she could have easily jumped across it. She went to the edge, lay down, and peered into it. As far as she could tell, it was still as deep as ever, and she was quite sure she could see the brook still running below, now covering the whole bottom. She walked on, keeping closer than ever to the edge. Now she could scarcely see it at all, and then it disappeared entirely. The edges simply met, like the end of a long piece of pie, and from then on, the trees grew right across it. She walked back to the last bit where the crack was still visible and stared down again. She could see nothing but blackness. The brook continued somewhere down there in a tunnel of its own, but she had lost her guideline. For the next few hundred yards or so, she could continue in the direction of the crevasse. She could continue in the direction the crevasse had been running. After that, when it got out of sight for good, there would be no way to tell which way she was going. People who walk in the woods with nothing to guide them, she had read, end up walking in great circles, getting nowhere. But, as it turned out, she need not have worried, for she had barely gone out of sight of the crevasse when she came abruptly to the end of her journey. The castle rose before her like a black thundercloud. There was the high fence, just as Otto had described it, enclosing a grassy courtyard as big as a village. Through it, crisscrossing like a gridiron, ran the strange black paths, shiny as wet asphalt, but curiously metallic in appearance. And just as Ellen arrived, a group of people came walking down one of them, heading toward her. As they came closer, she saw they were all boys, dressed in black. There were perhaps 50 of them, marching 4 abreast, not in step, but in a sort of pathetic, shuffling disorder. They were all very careful to stay on the path, however. Then, as they came directly in front of her, and the column began to turn to her right, she saw that the boy nearest her in the second row was Otto. As he turned, his eyes looked directly into hers, but they were as blank as the eyes of a sheep.